sing it. Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Sometimes it causes me to tremble, tremble. Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Were you there when they nailed him to the tree? Were you there when they nailed him to the tree? Were you there when they nailed him to the tree? Sometimes it causes me to tremble, tremble, tremble. Were you there when they nailed him to the tree? For about 10 years, ending in 1969, I had been working with an organization called the North Campus Religious Development, who had roots going back some 10 previous years, and whose aims and objectives were to build a magnificent ecumenical church just off from the intersection of Plymouth Road and Broadway, where you will see still a very lovely vacant piece of land. The various religious bodies in Ann Arbor had been working on this for a number of years, and it was finally my privilege to go on representing the Wesley foundations of the Methodist Church. And so we struggled for some 10 years. We have a perfectly magnificent set of blueprints. We did have a scale model. Someone probably has it in their basement or rec room now. We had a finance plan and a rather enormous undertaking, all very well organized. Out of it at least came the privilege to sit in the offices of some of the richest men in the state of Michigan. Finally, we got around to meet with some of the students who were going to benefit by this undertaking. I'll remind you that they were Catholics and Protestants and Jews and Mohammedans, a number of non-Christian, non-Jewish people. And I'll remind you that they were participating in religious activities on the campus, which to me means that they must have come out of a church background or the equivalent, whatever they call it, in their own family life. And we presented these plans to them. This was what we wanted to do. We were now ready to go. All we had to do was throw out the challenge. It was about $1.25 million building. It really was something to run these operations around the clock if you wanted to and not run into each other. When we'd finished our presentation, they fussed and fidgeted, and finally they said in effect, thanks, but no thanks. Don't bother to go out there and raise any more buildings. Don't make any more monuments to futility. If you want to do something, give us some funds with which to endow a chair that we might study and teach the humanities and brotherhood and peace. We have had enough of your church. One looks today and observes churches in something of a panic. It may be financial panic, or it may be the head count or body count. That's the term now, isn't it? Body count panic. It may be in a panic because of lack of participation and we can't get enough officers to fill the chairs, as they say. It may be the general decline, not only throughout the community of Ann Arbor, but throughout the world. Now, we Protestants can stand somewhat offish and grin a little bit to ourselves as we see all the troubles the Catholics are having, but we better not grin too much. I read recently in the Atlantic an article by Father Johnny Rue, who is one of the leaders of the revolution in the Jesuit organization. Now, the Jesuits began, if you do not happen to know it, as a kind of counter-Reformation after the Lutheran Reformation. They sprang up as a great teaching and instructing body. They were organized originally by a professional soldier turned clergyman, and he did an enormous amount of good, and for many, many years, in fact centuries, the order did an enormous amount of good. It was a strict discipline organization. It raised up colleges. It went out into the wildernesses, both of this America, but of other places also. And it brought not only the Word of God, but it brought education and literacy. It taught physicians. It taught other clergymen. It was an enormous organization, and now it almost appears that it's falling apart at the seams. There's so much rebellion within it. And Father John said in this article in Atlantic, what we've really been saying is that we're fighting over the last deck chair on the Titanic before she goes down. This ultra-strict order is scarcely able to command enough new recruits to keep it going. And of course, in some of the other orders less well known, we have seen in our own community one of their religious colleges or seminaries closed for lack of interest. And I can tell you that my own seminary had to join in, close its doors where it was located and join in with another in order to have enough students to keep enough professors to teach the courses. But these organizations, particularly, and it's easier, as I say, we're a little more comfortable to examine them, you see. We're a little self-righteous about it all. These organizations in Catholicism are torn apart by dissent and new and radical ideas, and you noticed in last night's paper in announcing various Easter services that a brand new Mass is going to be held in many of the churches, and one can just anticipate the old-timers putting their nose up in the air and saying, why don't they go back to the good, solid religion? But look at United Methodism or any other Protestant church throughout the world for a decade or more. The religious world has been shaken to its very foundations, and it's being shaken. And as prepared as I was for the kind of an answer for being shaken, in my business you do it, just expect to get shaken. I wasn't quite prepared to have a group of college students coming out of religious background say to me, don't bother to give us $1.25 million church, we don't want it. Maybe give us a nursery for our children because we're busy studying and there's no place for them to be. But if you can't do any better than that, we'll all meet down at the Commons or down at the laundromat and have our social and spiritual affairs there. Maybe it was a good thing that James Foreman went into that church in New York City, or that black man went into a half a dozen churches in Ann Arbor and stood up in the various pulpits and read something and deeply offended the self-righteous members of those congregations. Maybe it was a good thing for more reasons than one. Maybe for one thing, it shook them to the very foundations. So they rise up out of their lethargy and begin to think in terms of the seriousness of the hour. Well, I hear someone say I didn't get up so early in the morning to hear politics, but that's only a dirty name for something that you don't want to hear. like a communist is a dirty name for someone who doesn't agree with you. And it's a beautiful morning to get up and hear about anything. And if you're stirred up this morning so early in the morning, at least it's a long day to be stirred, and you can recover your sensibilities through the calming of the rest of the day. They would have said some of these same things about Jesus, you know. Just what is in store for the Christian religion of this decade that we're about to enter in? Well, I'll tell you, they would have said some of the same things about this decade that they would have said about Jesus. It's a stirring up. You remember one of the few charges that was brought against Jesus when he was brought before the tribunal and the judges? About all they could dream up was, he stirs up the people. What a horrible charge to bring against a man. And that was about all they could say. And that's about what's ahead for the church in this decade. Well, what really is ahead? Let me project a few things that I think are ahead for the church and for us, you and me both. For one thing, and this isn't particularly a religious nature, but all of these have religious implications. We're really going to begin to feel the pinch of this overcrowding of population. Oh, we're not going to go hungry in this nation yet. We're still too far ahead of the game. But we're going to feel it in the irritability that's around about us, and the busier highways, and when you want to get from here to there in a little less than nothing, and that slowpoke and those slowpokes and all the rest of the slowpokes are in your way. Stop and think sometime that it's the beginning of the crowding in of the population. Or when you can't find a place to park, or when we begin to find a pinch in such serious facilities as sewer and garbage disposal and water, without always being able to articulate what the trouble is, we're being closed in upon, and that's one of the things that you're going to feel more and more in the next 10 years. Another thing you're going to feel, and this may get a little closer to your religious sensibilities, is tension and conflict. I know we wish this morning that somehow we could have such a lovely service that it would all go away, and the tension and the conflict that existed in the world yesterday would vanish, but it will not. It will become worse. It will grow, and it will increase. Not necessarily the violence of riots, although this is also likely, but tension between individuals, tensions within families. We see it more and more in my office. We see it more and more in ministerial positions. We see it more and more in counseling offices. Tensions are growing up, and more we get calls in the night. The police get calls, the prosecutor gets calls, the clergyman gets calls, the lawyer gets calls. People are in trouble. Tension between groups is going to increase. I wish it were not so, but it is going to be so. One such, of course, is this racial tension. It will increase. It will not go away. It will increase. We have not really begun to scratch the surface in our understanding of the problems and position and situation and frustration of black people. We haven't even tried. We self-righteously tell ourselves, I read a book, or I heard a talk, or I did something, and I really am interested, and he really has had a rough lot, but he ought to be grateful for what he has. I'd say to you that the tensions have not even started to rise and surface as they will during the decade ahead. Tensions between economic groups. The poor have indeed gotten poorer. They have. We don't want to speak of it that way, but relatively speaking, the poor have gotten poorer, and there have become more of them. The shocking increases in welfare costs have gone largely into administrative expenses, and people who have living on welfare budgets have scarcely improved their lot in the past several years. Increased medical costs, increased prices. The general welfare of the poor has not improved, and they are becoming more numerous as our society is becoming more technical, and more people are unable to cope with it, to make their own way in life. We'd like to kid ourselves into thinking that we have improved the lot of many people, but it generally is not so, and these tensions will become greater, and picketing will become more common and more numerous until perhaps certain things break apart at the seams and changes begin. An ever larger group of people is cast out of the capability of making their own living. There just aren't that many ditches to dig anymore. And if there were that many ditches to dig, they can be dug quicker and easier and more economically and better with a machine and one man than they can with a lot of low-cost labor. And who wants clumsy ditch diggers around anyway? Tensions are going to increase between the age groups. We toss off the phrase generation gap. We have not begun to understand either what it is or how great it is. The tension between age groups, between the generations, is indeed very significant and very great, and it is much greater than it was when you of my generation were the age of the young people conducting this service today. It has always existed, to be sure, but in the past decade there's been a kind of worldwide revolt by youth, and this is going to continue and to increase in the decade ahead. For one thing, they're smarter than we are, and they're smarter than we were. They know a great many more things about a great many more things. Not that necessarily by nature they are more intelligent, but they know more than we did, and mostly than we do right now. The tension between those who place individuals above the state and those who place the state above the individual is going to increase. We have heard cries in our generations about states' rights. I'll tell you, the cries that are rising to the surface now are the cries about human rights. And this was exactly the thing that these young people were saying to us when they said, "Thanks, but no thanks. We don't want your $1.25 million memorial to futility. We want courses in human rights and human dignity." This cry for human rights above state is going to increase. Well, we've heard a great deal in our community more recently about the whole pollution of our environment. This will not only continue to increase, even as we talk about it, it will continue to increase, but it will accelerate until eventually there must be some kind of a bursting open and a revolt by the people against the thing that we ourselves are doing. You see, we have grown up with what some people have called the insidious Christian concept that the world was ours to despoil any way we wanted to. We're beginning to find out that maybe this world, I mean this material, earthly universe of ours, belongs to God after all. And if we insist upon despoiling it, we're going to drown in our own filth. And we may have to get rid of this, what has been called a Christian concept that the world belongs to us. Now I suggest another thing that's going to happen in this decade that we just started a few weeks ago. This I don't like any better than you like. This is one that some of us are closer to than others. The use of drugs is going to accelerate. I'm not going to give you my drug talk this morning, but the use of drugs is going to accelerate. Why? Because, for one thing, you and I, Dad, are pill heads. We have taught our children that the way out is by pills. And if you'd like to take a little inventory when you get home, look in the medicine chest or the kitchen cupboard and see how much dope there is there that Mother and Dad take. To get up in the morning and to get started and to take away the pains and to keep you going through the day and to give you a better appetite and to take off the fat and to lay you down, put you to sleep at night, and so you won't have any children, the whole works. They have grown up with the whole idea that this is a pill world, baby. And they're going to increase trying it themselves, I'm sorry to say. Any pill technique, any method, any screwball idea, or any television show will help you to escape from the troubles of this world. And so we have been teaching our young people for the past decade that the way out, baby, is to take some kind of medicine for it or have an escapism of some kind. And so they're trying to find it in the methods available to them, I'm sorry to say. Rather follows that drug use and dependence and addiction will increase among youth. We'd like to stop it or cure them with a concerted effort of law and order, but you and I have to stop and think that the conditions that make it not only possible and prevalent, but to many young people desirable, are conditions which we have created. And we have to go back further than mere law and order if we're going to get at the root cause of this thing that's going to continue on and on and on. Another idea that's going to occur more and more in this decade that we're in spite of periods of reaction, we're going to continue to see our cherished institutions crumble and many of them fall. We're going to see these attacks upon our institutions, particularly colleges and universities, particularly political institutions, and I am sorry to say that most of the attack which will not occur against religious institutions is because many young people do not consider them worth tearing down. They're sort of harmless, if you will. They serve a purpose to baptize babies and marry people in love and bury the dead. But they have no considerable impact in society, and so they're not going to do any considerable harm or any considerable good. And so we're not too much in danger of having our churches burned or torn down. Maybe we should be more concerned that we should be more liable to this kind of attack. Well, there are other suggestions that I could make, but these are enough. I want to get on with something else. It isn't a real happy world that we're going to enter, that we are in, that we're going to have to endure for another decade, and it may be more, and it may be less. And yet, with all, I think we should maintain the idea that it's a beastly challenging age in which to be alive. There are opportunities, and there is a great thing that can be accomplished, but we have to permit ourselves and our thoughts and our cherished concepts to be somewhat shaken and back off and take some personal inventories and consider a little bit the world which we live and which we have helped, the society which we have helped to build, and then perhaps we can begin to find something worth living for. Now, what hope is there? Well, it depends. If we want a codeine Christianity, if we want sugar-coated religion, if we want a painless formula to escape the wrath of our own creation, then it wouldn't matter too much whether you look to Christianity or Zen Buddhism or Mohammedanism or take your choice. But let's take a look at Jesus himself and see if there's anything to be offered by that view as a hope for the world in which we live. Our common concept of Jesus most of the year is of a rather simple, rather pleasant, rather effeminate, rather harmless character. Oh yes, we start out with sweet little baby away in a manger. Baby Jesus, sweet and mild. And out of this saccharine creation, we've tended to effeminize Jesus into a kind of an idealistic nothing. But like recalling the days of our youth, we remember what we want to remember. And we remember more about Easter in terms of the story of resurrection than we do about the story of the crucifixion. And if we do remember the crucifixion, we're likely to think of it as an isolated event within a matter of a few hours or minutes, rather than to a whole social process leading up to it. The same kind of process that might be going on today, shall I suggest? So we make Jesus into whatever image we wish, a kind of Alice in Wonderland transubstantiation. But let's just try being honest with ourselves. Let's tell it like it is, baby. Our first snapshot view after this infancy, after this sweet and innocent baby Jesus, is Jesus the dropout. First Christian dropout I ever heard of. He had to be the first one. He was it. He wasn't the first dropout, but he was the first Christian dropout. At the age of 12, when the family headed back home, he was missing. Where was he? Well, he goofed off. And he stayed back to pray? No, to raise hell with the priests. To irritate them, to agitate them, to make them mad, to say nasty things to them, to shake them, if you will. And that's just exactly what he did. And then the next thing we read is about Cousin John, and he was as big a radical. He sent the Pharisees right up the wall. These self-righteous, pious, these educated people who knew how to pray. And he said, "You generation of vipers, repent." And they didn't even know they had anything to repent about. It never occurred to them that they had to repent. They thought they were pretty good stuff. And then we read of Jesus going off by himself. But to be tempted, it says. I say to think. It's the same thing. If you start to think, you'll be tempted. If you get tempted, you better start to think. Jesus went off by himself to think or be tempted, depending on which side of the establishment wall you're on. Now, he was tempted by the devil. Well, the devil, you say. He was tempted by the establishment. Look at the power. Look at the authority. Man, you can get, with your tricks, you can get yourself elected president. Power, authority. Look at the money you'll make, baby. These were the temptations that came to Jesus. Yeah, I'm being facetious because I want to get through. But this is what happened. It was these temptations to be a successful man, to go to college and get an education and have a position in the community and belong to the Kiwanis Club. And Jesus said, "No. Thanks, but no thanks." Well, so it went with Jesus. Next, he went home and stood up in the temple. The family invited him to read the Bible. You know, it's nice to have the native son, come home and participate in the service. And it is. I'm not kidding. It is. But Jesus didn't do what he was supposed to do. You're supposed to follow the rules and regulations. He stood up and said, "I'm talking to you, Dad. What I'm reading means you. It doesn't mean somebody else. It means you. And it's about time you started to pay attention to it." And they were so offended, they threw him out of the church and turned him over to the crowd, and the crowd would have thrown him off the cliff, except he got away. They really would have harnessed him.